This is a Professor, CBMD PhD. And today, Sunday, October 22nd, 2023. It's 11:35 and 22 seconds, p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And today's research, UFO history. So let's hop to it here. In July 1994, the Office of the Secretary of the Air Force concluded an exhaustive search for records in response to a General Accounting Office inquiry of an event popularly known as the Roswell Incident. The focus of the General Accounting Office probe, initiated at the request of the New Mexico Congressman Stephen Schiff, was to determine if the U.S. Air Force or any other U.S. government agency possessed information on the alleged crash and recovery of an extraterrestrial vehicle and its alien occupants near Roswell and M in July 1947. Reports of flying saucers and alien bodies allegedly sighted in the Roswell area in 1947 have been the subject of intense domestic and international media attention. This attention has resulted in countless newspaper and magazine articles, books and television series, a full-length motion picture, and even a film purported to be a U.S. government alien autopsy. The July 1994 Air Force report concluded that the predecessor to the U.S. Air Force, U.S. Army Air Forces, did indeed recover material near Roswell in July 1947. This 1,000-page report methodically explains that what was recovered by the Army Air Forces was not the remnants of an extraterrestrial spacecraft and its alien crew, but debris from an Army Air Forces balloon borne research project, codenamed MOGO. Records located describing research carried out under the MOGO project, most of which were never classified and publicly available, were collected and provided to General Accounting Office and published in one volume for ease of access for the general public. Although MOGO components clearly accounted for the claims of flying saucer debris recovered in 1947, lingering questions remain concerning anecdotal accounts that included descriptions of alien bodies. The issue of bodies was not discussed extensively in the 1994 report because there was not any bodies connected with events that occurred in 1947. An extensive Secretary of the Air Force directed search of Army Air Forces and U.S. Air Force records from 1947 did not yield information that even suggested the 1947 Roswell events were anything other than the retrieval of the MOGO equipment. And subsequent to the 1994 report, Air Force researchers discovered information that provided a rational explanation for the alleged observations of alien bodies associated with the Roswell incident. And pursuant to the discovery research efforts compared to documented Air Force activities to the incredible claims of flying saucers, aliens, and seemingly unusual Air Force involvement. This in-depth examination revealed that these accounts, in most instances, were of actual Air Force activities, but were seriously flawed in several major areas, most notably the Air Force operations that inspired reports of bodies, in addition to being earthly in origin, did not occur in 1947. It appears that unidentified flying objects proponents have failed to establish the accurate dates for these alien observations, in some instances by more than a decade, and then erroneously linked them to the actual Project MOGO debris recovery. This report discusses the results and does further research and identifies the likely sources for the claims of alien bodies, contrary to allegations that the Air Force has engaged in a cover-up and possesses dark secrets involving the Roswell claims. Some of the accounts appear to be descriptions of unclassified and widely publicized Air Force scientific achievements. Other descriptions of bodies appear to be descriptions of actual incidents which Air Force members were killed or injured in the line of duty. The conclusions of the additional search are Air Force activities, which occurred over a period of many years, have been consolidated and are now represented to have occurred in 2 or 3 days in July 1947. Aliens observed in the New Mexico desert were probably anthropomorphic test dummies that were carried out aloft by U.S. Air Force high-altitude balloons for scientific research. The unusual military activities in the New Mexico desert were high-altitude research balloon launch and recovery operations. The reports of military units has always seemed to arrive shortly after the crash of a flying saucer to retrieve the saucer and crew were actually accurate descriptions of Air Force personnel engaged in anthropomorphic dummy recovery operations. As claims of bodies at the Roswell Army Airfield Hospital were most likely a combination of two separate incidents. One, a 1956 KC-97 aircraft accident in which 11 Air Force members lost their lives, and two, a 1959 manned balloon mishap in which 2 Air Force pilots were injured. The most puzzling and intriguing elements of the complex series of events now known as the Roswell incident are the alleged sightings of alien bodies. The bodies turned what for many years was just another flying saucer story, as it was many unidentifying flying objects proponents claim is the best case for extraterrestrial visitation of Earth. The importance of bodies and the assumptions made as their origin is illustrated in a passage from a popular Roswell book. As crash saucers are one thing that could well turn out to be futuristic American or even foreign aircraft or missiles, but alien bodies are another matter entirely and hardly subject to misinformation. The 1994 Air Force report determined that Project Mogul was responsible for the 1947 events. Mogul was an experimental attempt to acoustically detect suspected Soviet nuclear weapon explosions and ballistic missile launches. Mogul utilized acoustical sensors, radar reflecting targets, and other devices attached to the train of weather balloons over 600 feet long. Claims that the U.S. Army Air Forces recovered a flying disc in 1947 were based primarily on the lack of identification of the radar targets and elements of weather equipment used on the Long Mogul balloon train. The oddly constructed radar targets were found by a New Mexico rancher during the height of the first U.S. flying saucer wave in 1947. The rancher brought the remnants of the balloons and radar targets to the local sheriff after he allegedly learned of the broadcasted reports of flying discs. However, following some of the initial confusion at Roswell Army Airfield, the flying disc was soon identified by Army Air Forces officials as a standard radar target. From 1947 until late 1970s, the Roswell incident was essentially a non-story. The reports that existed contained only descriptions of mundane materials that originated from the Project Mogul balloon train, tinfoil paper tape, rubber, and sticks. The first claim of bodies appeared in the late 1970s, with additional claims made during the 1980s and 1990s. The first claim of bodies appeared in the late 1970s, with additional claims made during the 1980s and 1990s. These claims were usually based on anecdotal accounts of second and third hand witnesses collected by UFO proponents as much as 40 years after the alleged incident. The same anecdotal accounts that referred to bodies also describe massive field operations conducted by the U.S. military to recover crash debris from a supposed extraterrestrial spacecraft, a technique used by some UFO authors to collect anecdotal corroboration for the theories was to solicit cooperating witnesses through newspaper announcements. For example, one such solicitation appeared on November 4, 1992. According to Moore and Gildenberg, they met with the authors. Their explanations that some of the Air Force projects they participated in were most likely responsible for the incident. They were summarized dismissed. The authors even went so far as to suggest that these distinguished scientists were participants in the multifaceted government cover-up to conceal the truth about the Roswell incident. And since many of the Roswell accounts and allegations were collected by irregular methods and are not specifically documented, the series of events, as alleged by UFO theorists, has become very complex and requires clarification. Therefore, the following section will briefly examine some of the more confusing elements of the Roswell stories, specifically the multiple crash sites and complex scenarios, in order to facilitate an objective analysis of actual events. From 1947 until late 1970s, the Roswell incident was confined to one alleged crash site, the site located on the Foster Ranch approximately 75 miles northwest of the city of Roswell, was the actual landing site of Project Mogul balloon train in 1947. The Mogul landing site is referred to in popular Roswell literature as a debris field. In the 1970s and 1980s and throughout the 1990s, additional witnesses came forward with claims and descriptions of 2 other alleged crash sites. One of these sites was supposedly north of Roswell. The other site was alleged to have been approximately 175 miles northwest of Roswell, an area of New Mexico known as the San Augustine planes was distinguished to the two crash sites from the original debris field were accounts of alien bodies. UFO enthusiasts have attempted to explain the obvious contradiction of multiple impact sites involving only one alien craft through the introduction of complicated scenarios. These scenarios have become increasingly convoluted since the proponents of each crash site must make allowances to have their flying saucer at the correct time and place. The actual Mogul balloon train landing site in early July 1947 in order to fit with the rest of the story. The actual Project Mogul landing site 75 miles northwest of Roswell lends credibility and then more importantly establishes a time frame for the other accounts that include reports of bodies. Flying saucer enthusiasts use the documented presence of U.S. Army Air Forces personnel at the Mogul site in July 1947 who were there to retrieve the Mogul balloon train to provide the nucleus of the unrelated and much later accounts that include reports of bodies. It must be emphasized that the claim of bodies only became part of the Roswell incidents after 1978 when they were erroneously linked to the July 1947 retrieval of Project Mogul components. In general, Roswell incident scenarios claim that the disabled alien craft momentarily touched down at a site 75 miles northwest of Roswell, leaving behind parts of the spacecraft material that had been subsequently identified as components of a Mogul balloon train to create the original debris field. The scenario further contends that the damaged craft again became airborne and flew to its final crash site at either the location north of Roswell or 175 miles northwest of Roswell on the San Augustine Plains. Regardless of dispute over the location, an element common in most scenarios was that once recovered, the bodies were supposedly transported to the hospital at Roswell Army Airfield for autopsy. Also common to these theories is that the bodies were later shipped from Roswell AAF to another facility, usually Wright-Patterson, AFB, Ohio, or a host of other facilities. This is another area of further disagreement among UFO theorists for further evaluation and ultimate deep freeze storage. In an attempt to untangle this collection of complicated assertions and determine if there was any validity to the reports, the body's Air Force researchers faced the task of sorting through and examining anecdotal testimony of hundreds of witnesses. However, a large number of the accounts were eliminated by applying previously established facts to the testimonies. The July 1994 report to the Secretary of Air Force clearly presented and documented these facts. The U.S. Army Air Forces did not recover an extraterrestrial vehicle and alien crew. The conclusion was based on extensive research that included a thorough review of both classified and unclassified materials at record depositories, archives, libraries, and research facilities throughout the nation. Of the millions of pages of material reviewed, there was no mention of any activities that even tangentially suggested such an event. Additionally, former retired Air Force members and civilian contract scientists were located and released from any possible non-disclosure agreements they may have entered into regarding past classified activities. This release allowed them to freely discuss with Air Force researchers or any other persons information related to the issue. These releases were issued at the express written direction of the Secretary of the Air Force. Interviews with these persons yielded no information supporting extraterrestrial claims or any other unusual activity. The reports of bodies were not associated with Project Mogul. The Project Balloon Train was not designed to, nor could it carry passengers. Neither did it carry hazardous materials that could have caused injury, death, or mutilation to persons who may have come in contact with any of its components. Actual events, if any, that inspired reports of bodies did not occur in 1947, based on extensive examinations of U.S. Army Air Forces activities in 1947. No evidence was found to support allegations that the Army Air Forces was involved in any uncommon operations other than the retrieval of the Mogul balloon train in the Roswell area in July 1947. Examination of research and development projects, Air Force crashes, air rent, missiles, and possible nuclear accidents yielded no information to support the 1947 claim. In light of these documented facts, the hundreds of anecdotal accounts were reduced to a few, eliminated, or accounts that were likely descriptions of materials known to be part of the Project Mogul balloon train and accounts describing transportation of these materials. From the remaining testimony, Air Force researchers developed the following set of working hypotheses to assist to the identifying of actual events, if any, matching those described by the witnesses. Due to the number of great detail provided in some of the accounts, it was likely that some events actually did occur. Due to the many similarities of the two crash site descriptions and the considerable distance between them, it was likely that more than one event with similar characteristics was the basis of these accounts. And since the account of bodies at the Roswell Army Airfield Hospital did not contain elements similar to the reports of two crash sites, it was likely that this account was unrelated to the crash site accounts. The hospital accounts will be addressed separately in Section 2 of this report. The remaining testimony was examined with regard both to the facts and to the working hypothesis to determine if there were common threads or links connecting any of the accounts. If similarities were found, the next step was to determine if they were related to the actual event. Finally, if there were actual events, they were part of the U.S. Air Force or U.S. government activity. Careful examination of the testimony revealed primary witnesses, the two crash saucer locations contained descriptions common to both. These areas of commonality contain both general and detailed characteristics. However, before continuing, the accounts were carefully examined to determine if the testimony related by individual witnesses or of their own experiences and not a recitation of information given by other persons. While many aspects of the remaining accounts were judged to be similar, other aspects were found to be significantly different. The accounts on which the analysis is based or determined in all likelihood to have been independently obtained or observed by the witnesses. The testimony presented for both crash sites generally followed by the same sequence of events. The witnesses were in rural and isolated area of New Mexico. In the course of their travels in this area, they came upon a crashed aerial vehicle. The witnesses then proceeded to the area of the crash to investigate, and at some distance they observed strange-looking beings that appeared to be crew members of the vehicle. And soon thereafter a convoy of military vehicles and soldiers arrived at the site. Military personnel allegedly instructed the civilians to leave the area and forget what they had seen. As soon witnesses left the area, the military personnel commenced with a recovery operation of the crashed aerial vehicle and crew. Along with general similarities in the testimonies, there also existed a substantial amount of similar, detailed descriptions of the aliens, of the military vehicles, and procedures allegedly used to recover them. The first obvious similarity was the descriptions of the aliens. Mr. Gerald Anderson, an alleged witness of the events at the site 175 miles northwest of Roswell, recalled, "I thought they were plastic dolls." Mr. James Verdale, an alleged witness of the site north of Roswell, stated they were using dummies in those damn things. Another alleged witness to the crash north of Roswell, Frank Hoffman, recalled that there was talk that perhaps an experimental plane with dummies in it was the source of the claims. Additional similarities were also noted. Mr. Vern Maltaz, a second-hand witness of the site 175 miles northwest of Roswell, described the hands of the aliens as they had 4 fingers. Anderson characterized the hands as they didn't have a little finger. He also described the hands of the aliens as completely bald, while Maltaz described them as hairless. The uniforms of the aliens were independently described by Anderson as one-piece suits, a shiny silverish gray color, and by Maltaz one-piece and gray in color. The date of this event was also not precisely known. Maltaz recalled that it may have occurred around 1950. Another second-hand witness, Alice Knight, stated, "I don't recall the date." Witnesses at different sites also used the terms wrecker and 6x6 when they described the military vehicles present at the different recovery sites. One witness is described seeing a medium-sized Jeep truck, and another witness described seeing a weapons carrier. A weapons carrier is a mid-sized Jeep tank truck. When the general and specific similarities were combined, a profile emerged describing the event or activity that might have been observed. The profile, which contains elements common to at least 2, and in some cases, all the accounts established a set of criteria used to determine what the witnesses may have observed. The profile is as follows. An activity that is viewed from a distance would appear unusual, an activity of which the exact date is not known. An activity that took place in 2 rural areas of New Mexico, an activity that involved a type of aerial vehicle with dolls or dummies that had 4 fingers, were bald, or wore one-piece gray suits, an activity that required recovery by numerous military personnel, and an assortment of vehicles that included a Wrecker, a 6x6, and a weapons carrier. As based on this profile, research has begun to identify events or activities with these characteristics. Due to the location of the sites, attention was focused on Roswell AAF, renamed Walker AFB, 1948, White Sands Missile Range, and Holland AFB, NM. Aerial vehicles assigned are under development of these facilities, were aircraft missiles, remotely piloted drones, and high-altitude balloons. The operational characteristics in areas where these vehicles flew were researched to determine if they played a role in events described by the witnesses. Missiles and drones were determined not to have been responsible for the accounts. The areas that were alleged crashes took place, in all likelihood, too far from the White Sands Missile Range. Missiles were equipped with a self-destruct mechanism that was activated if it stayed off course or out of the White Sands Missile Range. There was never a program that required a dummy or doll to be placed inside a missile or a drone. However, missiles were launched from White Sands, carrying monkeys and other small animals aloft for scientific research. These projects were well documented, and none of these missiles landed near either of the two crash sites. Aircraft seemed just as unlikely as missiles to have been responsible for the extraterrestrial claims as outlined in the profile. Although additional research revealed a significant role dummies played in the test and evaluation of aircraft emergency escape systems, these dummies were used on board aircraft on the high-speed test track at Holland AFB. However, aircraft test flights demanded strict adherence to established flight profiles over the instrumental portions of the White Sands Missile Range, many miles from the alleged crash sites. As dummies used on the high-speed track remained in the immediate vicinity of the track facilities at Holland AFB, this geographical impossibility ruled out dummies that were ejected from aircraft and those used on high-speed track as a cause of alleged alien sightings. Aircraft accidents will be discussed extensively in Section 2 of this report. The only vehicles not yet evaluated as a possible source for the accounts were high-altitude research balloons. Previous reviews of the early research balloon flight records revealed that trajectories of high-altitude balloons were at times unpredictable and did not usually remain over Holman AFB or White Sands Missile Range. Many of the scientific payloads required recovery so that data collected during flight could be returned to the laboratory for analysis. These characteristics seem to fit at least some of the research profile, atmospheric sampling apparatus, or weather instruments. The typical payload of many high-altitude balloons could hardly have been mistaken for space aliens. A careful examination of the instruments carried aloft by high-altitude balloons revealed that one unique project used a device that very unlikely could be mistaken for an alien and anthropomorphic dummy. An anthropomorphic dummy is a human substitute equipped with a variety of instrumentation to measure the effects of environments and situations deemed too hazardous for a human. These abstractly human dummies were first used in New Mexico in May 1950 and have been used on a continuous basis since that time. In the 1950s, anthropomorphic dummies were not widely exposed outside of the scientific research circles and easily could have been mistaken for something they were not. As today, anthropomorphic dummies, better known as crash test dummies, are easily identifiable and are even the stars of their own automotive safety advertising campaign. During the 1950s, when the U.S. Air Force dropped the odd-looking test devices from high-altitude balloons in its program to study high-altitude human free-fall characteristics, public awareness and stardom were decades away. It seems likely that someone who unexpectedly observed these dummies at a distance would believe they had seen something unusual. In retrospect, when interviewed over 40 years later, they can accurately report that they had seen something very unusual. With the introduction of anthropomorphic dummies as a possible explanation for the reported bodies, another element of the research profile appeared to be satisfied. Specific information as described the locations, methods, and procedures used to employ the dummies was required before any definitive conclusions could be drawn. And to gather this detailed information, research efforts were concentrated on high-altitude balloon operations and the specific projects that utilized balloon-borne anthropomorphic dummies. And since the beginning of the manned flight, designers have sought a substitute for the human body to test hazardous new equipment. Early devices used by the predecessors of the U.S. Air Force were simply constructed parachute drop test dummies with little similarity to the human form. And following World War II, aircraft emergency escape systems became increasingly sophisticated, and engineers required a dummy with more human-like characteristics. During World War I research The development of the first U.S. military parachute underway at McCook Field, Ohio, to test the parachute engineers experimented with several types of dummies, settling on a model constructed of 3-inch hemp, rope, and sandbags with the approximate proportions of a medium-sized man. The new invention was soon known by the nickname Dummy Joe. Dummy Joe is said to have made more than 5,000 jumps between 1918 and 1924. And by 1924, parachutes were required on military aircraft with their serviceability test by dummies dropped by aircraft for the routine testing. Several types of dummies were used. The most common type is shown in Figure 17 and 18. Parachutes were individually dropped, tests from aircraft until early stages of World War II, but do both to increase reliability and large numbers of parachutes in service. This routine practice was discontinued. Nonetheless, test dummies were still used frequently by the Parachute Branch of Air Materiel Command, AMC, at Wright Field, Ohio, to test new parachute designs. The ejection seat had been developed and used successfully by the German Luftwaffe during the later stages of World War II. The utility of this invention was realized when the U.S. Army Air Forces obtained an ejection seat in 1944. And to properly test the ejection seat, the Army Air Forces required a dummy that had the same center of gravity and weight distribution as a human, characteristics that parachute drop dummies did not possess. In 1944, the USAAF Air Materiel Command contracted with the Ted Smith Company of Upper Darby, PA, to design and manufacture first dummy intended to accurately represent a human. The dummy had the same basic shape as a human, but with only abstract human features and skin made of canvas. In 1949, the U.S. Air Force Aeromedical Laboratory submitted a proposal for an improved model for the anthropomorphic dummy. This request was originated by the renowned Air Force scientist and physician John P. Stapp, now retired colonel, who conducted a series of landmark experiments in Iraq, now Edward A.F.B. Calif, to measure the effects of acceleration and deceleration during high-speed aircraft ejections. Stapp required a dummy that had the same center of gravity and articulation as a human, but unlike the Ted Smith dummy, was more human in appearance. A more accurate external appearance was required to provide for the proper fit of helmets, oxygen masks, and other equipment used during the test. Stapp requested the anthropology branch of the Aeromedical Laboratory at Wright Field to review anthropological, orthopedic, and engineering literature to prepare specifications for the new dummy. Last took casts of the torso, legs, and arms of the Air Force pilot were also taken to assure accuracy. The result was proposed dummy that stood 72 inches tall, weighed 200 pounds, had provisions for mounting instrumentation, and could withstand up to 100 times the force of gravity, or 100 Gs. In 1949, a contract was awarded to Syria Engineering Company for Syria Bay, California. The deliveries began in 1950. This dummy quickly became known as Syria Sam. In 1952, a contract for anthropomorphic dummies was awarded to Elderson Research Laboratories, Incorporation of New York City. Dummies constructed by both companies possess the same basic characteristics: a skeleton of aluminium or steel, latex or plastic skin, a cast aluminium skull, an instrument cavity in the torso, and head for the mounting of strain gauges, accelerometers, transducers, and rate gyros. Models used by the Air Force were primarily parachute drop and ejection seat versions, with center of gravity tolerances within 1/4 inch. Over the next several years, the two companies improved and redesigned internet structures and instrumentation, but the basic external appearance of the dummies remained relatively constant from the mid-1950s to the late 1960s. Dummies of these types were most likely the aliens associated with the Roswell incident. From 1953 to 1959, anthropomorphic dummies were used by the U.S. Air Force Aeromedical Laboratory as part of the high-altitude aircraft escape projects. High dive and exolyzer. The object of these studies was a device, a method to return a pilot or astronaut to Earth by parachute if forced to escape at extreme altitudes. Anthropomorphic dummies were transported to altitudes up to 98,000 feet by high-altitude balloons. The dummies were then released for a period of free fall, while body movements and escape equipment, performance, were recorded by a variety of instruments, and 23 high-altitude balloon flights carrying 67 anthropomorphic dummies were launched and recovered throughout the New Mexico between June 1954 and February 1959. Due to prevailing wind conditions, operational methods, and regiments for the terrain, the majority of dummies impacted outside the confines of military reservations in eastern New Mexico, near Roswell, and the area surrounding Tularosa Valley in south central New Mexico. Additionally, 30 dummies were dropped by aircraft over White Sands, Proving Ground, NM in 1953. In 1959, 150 dummies were dropped by aircraft over Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, Ohio, possibility accounting for alleged alien sightings at that location. A number of these launch and recovery locations were in the areas where the crash saucer and space aliens were allegedly observed following a series of dummy tests. A human subject, says Pilot Cap Joseph A. Kittler, Jr., now retired colonel, made 3 parachute jumps from high-altitude balloons, and since free-fall tests from these unprecedented altitudes were extremely hazardous, they cannot be accomplished by a human until a rigorous testing program using anthropomorphic dummies was completed. As countering claims of the cover-up, Air Force projects that use anthropomorphic dummies and human subjects were unclassified and widely publicized in numerous newspaper and magazine stories, books, and television reports. A characterization of Kittinger's record parachute jumping when appeared in the adolescent magazine Mad, the intense public interest of high dive, Exelizer, and other aeromedical projects conducted at Holman Air Force Base also resulted in 1956 20th Century Fox full-length motion picture On the Threshold of Space. And for the majority of the tests, dummies were flown to altitudes between 30,000 and 98,000 feet, attached to a specially designed rack suspended below a high-altitude balloon. On several flights, the dummies were mounted to the door of an experimental high-altitude balloon gondola. Upon reaching the desired altitude, the dummies were released and pre-filled for several minutes before deployment of the main parachute. This video was created for educational purposes only. Codename Will, Professor Christopher Brunet, leader of research, scientist, ufologist, psychic, computer programmer, computer technician, philanthropist, writer, mathematician, artist, photographer, film producer, chef, animal, and nature lover. Passion, world peace. Hope you enjoyed listening. Until next time, have an excellent day. This is a Professor, CBMD, PhD.